So today I want to talk about one of the oldest openings in chess, the Ruy Lopez. And in particular, I want to talk about, from the black perspective, what variations should you play against this opening, because there are so many lines that you can pick. You can go for the Berlin, you can go for one of these lines with a6, you can even go for, say, something very sharp like the Schliemann Gambit. And I want to cover all of these approaches in this video, ranking them from the F tier. These are variations which hopefully you are not playing, and after this video, if you are playing them, stop playing them, and then eventually going all the way up to the S tier, where I talk about what, at least in my opinion, are the very best approaches against this opening. But to get right into things, we're going to start off with the F tier. And these are variations which, again, like, I don't think anyone should really play. There's just no reason to play them. The first one's going to be the so-called bird defense with knight d4. And there's a similar sort of variation you've probably seen against the Italian before, where knight d4 is a thing here. And there's this trap where if white takes on e5, black can go queen g5 and get this sort of kind of winning attack right off the bat. But of course, the issue is that you just take it, and now black has double d pawns, and their setup doesn't really make much sense. And a similar thing is possible with the Ruy Lopez. After knight d4, white just takes it. And the thing is that, at least in the Italian, because there's a bishop on c4, when you play knight d4, you're not like attacking the bishop on b5 or anything. So it's a lot more tempting for white to actually take the pawn on e5, and then trap them with this whole queen g5 thing, right? Whereas again, in the Ruy Lopez, unless your opponent is a complete beginner, they're not going to hang their bishop like this. And so they're probably going to see like, okay, they're forking this and this, I'm just going to take it, give them double pawns, and you know, like, off we go. This should be a pretty good position. And for example, a typical plan in this position for white would just simply to be, say, castle next, play d3, f4, and start storming the kingside pawns forward. And I think white has pretty good chances in this position. The next variation, which is going to be in the F tier and is also pretty bad, is the so-called Steinitz defense, where black plays d6. And the reason the Steinitz is bad is it's just very passive. Like, white plays d4 very quickly, and now after e takes d4, knight takes d4, because black has played d6, of course there's this annoying pin they have to deal with. They have to play very passively with something like bishop d7, white's going to play knight d3, castles, and white just enjoys a very nice base advantage in the center with this e4 pawn against the sort of more restrained d6 one. And because of that, I just see absolutely no reason to play this variation with black. Very passive, very boring. There's literally, at least from what I understand, nothing good to say about it. I should also note, technically, black does not have to take on d4. They could play bishop d7, and one mistake I see some players play is they think that they can win a pawn as white like this, but in fact there's stuff like bishop takes e4 or d takes e5 and eventually taking back this e4 pawn. But if white instead just plays something like knight c3 in this position, keeps the tension a little bit more, again, it's just still like a very passive position for black. I do not recommend this. And so another variation, which is a bit of a troll one, but I don't know, maybe some of you guys play this. It's the so-called Hambleton variation, named after a man Hambleton, where I think I've seen like one video of his online where he plays this. And I think basically the idea is you play like castles, bishop c5, and you basically just, with your piece placement, make it very difficult for white rather, to ever get in break like c3, d4, and in the long term you maybe want to play knight e7, like h6, g5 maybe, and start like getting some kingside attack going, especially if like you aggressively plays queen here, right? But it's really just too good to be true. Like, you shouldn't bring your queen out this early. This is sort of an opening sin, and a very principled way to try and exploit that, let's say, would be to play c3, and we're just trying to play d4 next. If black plays bishop c5, white can play the very principled d4, takes e5, and this is completely busted pretty much for black. If you take it, there's queen e2, there's a pin. If you defend it, or you can't even defend it because the pin here, and if you go this way, well then c takes d4 rather, and again, you're just completely busted. And for the final variation in the F tier, we're going to be talking about the Schliemann deferred. And first of all, the Schliemann, or the Schliemann Gambit, is where black plays f5 in this position. And we're going to be talking about this more later. This is quite playable actually. However, the Schliemann deferred is when black plays a6 first, bishop a4, and now f5. However, there's a huge difference that makes this one a lot worse than the other one, in that white can play this very sharp counter-attacking move d4, and black is actually in a lot of trouble in this variation. And the reason is, if we compare this to the normal Schliemann in this position, when white plays d4, black can take and meet knight takes e5 with takes, and c6, and actually this position is quite problematic for the white pieces, because wherever we move our bishop, essentially what's going to happen is black's going to play queen a5 check, fork the king and pawn, and they're going to be doing absolutely fine in this position. Whereas if we compare this to the Schliemann deferred, now if we go into the same variation, it just does not work, because look what we've done when we played a6. We've kicked the bishop to the a4 square, so that means if we play a move like c6, well, not only does this look very weakening with the dark squares, but actually it doesn't gain a tempo on the bishop on a4, so probably what white is going to do in this position is just play castles, and what is black doing with their life? It's not very obvious. Like, for example, if you really did want to try to play queen a5 and then take the pawn on e5, well, because white has this extra tempi of castling, now they can play knight takes e4 actually, and you can't really take because rook e1, and you're pretty much dead lost. So moving into the C tier, these are some lines which are not like completely terrible. They're a little bit better than the ones we discussed in the last section, but still, they can be very unpleasant if the opponent sort of knows what they're doing. And the first one is going to be this so-called Cosio variation with moving the knight to e7. And basically one of the goals black has, we're going to be looking at a variation very similar later, is to play something like g6, bishop g7, and go for this sort of fianchetto setup. Another aim is also that, you know, for example, in many variations of the Ruy Lopez, especially if we play a6 immediately, is going to be like the exchange variation. Something like the Cosio already eliminates that, because now after bishop takes c6, this is really nonsensical. You give up your bishop for no reason, and you don't even get to double black's pawns because they can actually take back with the knight. And some very typical variations that you might see is something like castles g6, and if white ever plays d4, black will play bishop g7, and they're kind of doing okay in these positions. However, there's one very problematic variation that I learned when I was younger, and ever since I have pretty much just thought the Cosio was complete and utter trash, which is that if white plays this very accurate move knight c3, which granted, maybe not everyone knows, is that if you now try to go for g6, white's going to play d4, and the point is again not that we're going to go for something like this with white, and I think black's sort of doing okay in these positions. The issue is that after d4, he takes d4, now it's going to be knight d5, and this is just a really unpleasant position to play, because now if you go bishop g7, there's this move bishop g5. I should note you probably don't want to take this, because then you're going to have to go back, and then queen takes d4, really bad position. So after bishop g7, bishop g5, now if you play h6 is going to be this move bishop f6, and this whole line just, yeah, I don't know, I've never really liked it. And technically what you could do in this position after knight c3 is play something like knight g6 instead, and this does score a little bit better because it avoids the line we were talking about earlier. But still, I'm pretty skeptical of this one. I don't really believe spending so many tempi with the knight early on like this, only to put it on a square like g6. So again, the Cosio, it has to go into the C tier. And I'm going to be putting one other variation into the C tier. This one is going to be the so-called classical variation where white plays bishop c5. And we're going to be looking at a bunch of variations in this video where white puts a bishop on this sort of diagonal. Sorry, my arrows are terrible, but nonetheless, you get the point, where they're trying to aim for a bit more of an active setup compared to many of the ones in the closed Spanish we often get, where we have, say, the following moves of a6, bishop a4, etc, and now we have bishop e7, and like, this is very solid, don't get me wrong, but for many players this is going to be just a little bit too sort of, I don't want to say boring, but you get the idea, where the bishop is just a little bit less active on this diagonal than it is this one, right? However, the classical variation, again, I don't think it's one of the better sort of versions you can get of these sort of lines where you have a bishop on c5. One subtle reason already is that when you play a6 first and then go, say, like bishop c5, in many variations you can actually sort of tuck your bishop in the a7 square due to these moves being inserted, right? Whereas when you go bishop c5 immediately, you don't really have that luxury. However, that being said, there is one clear idea that black has in this variation, which is if white castles, they can play knight d4. And now we get sort of an improved variation upon the bird variation, because now if we go here, bishop takes d4, notice how we don't have to take back with the e pawn, we can instead take back with the bishop, and we sort of make this piece exchange, which we sort of say is favorable to us. We also exchange off sort of a defender over the white king. However, the sort of issue is, like, while that variation is not so bad, white can actually just in this position play c3, stop any knight d4 ideas, go d4 very quickly, and I find it very hard to justify this position for black. It just seems incredibly sketchy to me. For example, one line is knight f6, d4 takes, e5, knight e4 takes, and there's some continuation like bishop b4 check, knight bd2. But yeah, I just don't believe in this. If you make a bunch of exchanges, black just has a lot less space. If white is allowed, they're going to go d5 next and really just ram black over. So again, I would probably avoid the classical variation. It's like borderline playable, like maybe these lines aren't completely losing, and you also have some option maybe of, say, like f5 in this position, a very sharp gambit. But like, this is pretty dubious and I probably wouldn't go into this. So moving on to the B tier now, we're actually getting to somewhat legit territory where the lines I'm showing you, these aren't like probably the theoretically most robust lines, but a lot of these lines would be pretty good surprise weapons, and maybe for some of you guys who are a bit lower rated, you could probably base your black repertoire around some of these lines. And the first one is going to be the Screamer's Gambit. And this one, especially at lower levels, I think is very tricky to face. A lot of people just get scared if they take, for example. I think this is already quite bad after e4. But realistically, I mean, the reason the Screamer is only in B tier is because, concretely speaking, white has some pretty good choices against it. For example, knight c3 used to sort of be the main line, or at least considered to be the most critical variation that sort of white could pick against the Screamer, where basically after takes, there were some super sharp lines of d5 that weren't quite sound, I believe, where you have some stuff like takes, knight takes c6, queen g5, and white's supposed to be better, but practically speaking, unless you've actually studied this from the white perspective before, which a lot of players have not, it's really difficult to actually find all the best moves in an actual like real game situation. But there was also technically this other more sound option where black goes knight f6 instead, and these variations I believe are also quite tricky. I'm not really a Ruy Lopez player, I don't know all the most cutting edge theory, but what I do know is back in the day when I did play Ruy Lopez, I played this move d3, and I was very surprised actually to see recently that this is what most of the top players have been doing recently. They've been sticking to this very just solid option against the somewhat passive it may look at first sight. But basically one of the ideas is that now white is actually somewhat threatening to go e takes f5, because their last move made it so that now after e takes f5, if black ever plays e4, we can just take the pawn. We don't have to retreat our knight or anything like that, right? So like one thing you have to keep in mind if you play the Schliemann is that you actually have to make this exchange in this position. You can't really play knight f6, which a lot of players do. It's a very common mistake, because now after e takes f5, it's actually very difficult to win back the pawn under like good circumstances. For example, like if you go d6, castles, bishop takes f5, white has this very strong break d4, and it's very difficult to sort of meet this adequately. D takes e5 is a threat, d5 is also potentially one, and if you take it, white's pieces become very active, and this is again very unpleasant to deal with. But yeah, I don't know, personally these positions after takes, say knight f6, castles, black say plays something like bishop c5, trying to get the bishop active on this diagonal. You can also play something a bit more like passive with d6, bishop e7, or I don't know if passive is a word, but at least sort of from an outward perspective it looks less active than say like just plopping your bishop on the c5 square. And sort of one of the key points is that you basically say like, I'm not super scared of white just grabbing the pawn on e5, because I have the bishop here and I believe I have a lot of compensation, which to me seems slightly sketchy. And like granted you're not forced to go for this, you can again go for d6, but again these are just some things you're going to want to keep in mind if you play this opening. So the next line we're going to be talking about, radically different to the Schliemann, and this one is going to be the Stein's third with a6, bishop a4 and d6. We talked about something very similar earlier, right? But the Stein's is much worse, because in this position if we go d6, d4 again, very unpleasant. Whereas coming back to the Stein's third, d4 is now not as strong because of this very well-known trap called the Noah's Ark trap, I believe it's called, where after b5, bishop b3, black can play knight takes d4, and after takes, if white takes this is very risky, because now after c5, we're attacking their queen, but more importantly, we're also threatening to just trap their bishop. And you might think, but Sam, they can play queen d5. Aha, I got you, but not quite, because after bishop e6, check back, now we go c4, and of course compared to going c4 immediately, where we would have been hanging our rook, now the bishop is on d7, so this is protected, and black is just completely winning. However, matters of course not that straightforward. You will have a lot of people who actually go d4 and just fall for that trap, but there are some better options. For example, like white going say castles, you'll probably play bishop d7 to cut the pin off, white plays something like c3, and very often our game plan is to go g6, meet d4 with bishop g7, and the very common scenario that will arise in this opening is white will play d5, you will retreat, they will take you, you will take back, they will play c4, and we have an interesting position right now where we very much do have a King's Indian structure, except many would sort of argue this is a bad version of the King's Indian for black because we have traded off the knight squared bishops. And this is important to keep in mind because in these sorts of King's Indian structures, very often the knight squared bishop is considered white's bad bishop and it's sort of black's good bishop at the same time, right? And so many would just look at that sort of aspect alone and then at face value sort of assume that, okay, this variation must sort of be not so great then. But things are actually not that simple, because in this position, black has this plan of going for the quick f5 break, making use of the fact we have not yet developed our knight on the g8 square. And even though we have traded off our knight squared bishop, the fact we're able to get an f5 so quickly really does compensate for that factor. However, we want to be careful to not play f5 immediately, because then the weaknesses of our knight squares really will shine, where after knight g5, knight e6, this square is a really weak sort of outpost that white can use. So we want to be careful to first play h6, then only go f5, knight f6, and in practice, this actually scores quite well for black, and I personally would not mind playing this at all. However, there is sort of an issue, so to speak, that white can play a tricky move in this position, such as rook e1, keeping attention, and now things are a little bit trickier, because say in this position, if we want to play something like knight f6, well then we block the f pawn, right? And now if white goes for this, they have a bit of a better version of the other variation we just looked at, because again, it takes a bit more time to get in the f5 break. And in these sorts of King's Indian type positions where we have opposite flank attacks, time is of the essence. We don't really want to have to waste more time retreating the knight, then going f5, and you might be like, well Sam, what if we go f5 in this position? But keep in mind, black has not yet committed to d5, the central structure is still closed. This would be a really stupid decision, because they'd just take a bunch of times and just like absolutely like rip us to shreds. So then what we might do is play something like knight e7, but now say in this position if white plays d5, we play knight b8, already notice that our knight has to come to this square, and it wouldn't be so bad if white takes us, and then like all of a sudden our knight's ready to go over to like the king's side again, right? But if they just sort of leave our knight on b8, well then all of a sudden we see a clear difference between the other variation where they played d5 immediately and this one where they sort of kept the tension. And we're sort of getting down like a rabbit hole now of like nuances. It's probably best I stop it off here. Basically, this style is deferred. It has some issues with it. Whether your opponents know that or not, that's a little bit unlikely. And so again, talking about another one of these lines where black puts a bishop on c5, we're going to be talking about the so-called Indian defense. And this is a line I didn't know up until a couple of weeks ago, because it's very rare, and it was only because one of my former coaches I was talking to, he was talking to me how he was writing some like chessboard course in this variation, where basically the idea is that instead of say putting like a knight in f6, which you often do in many of these lines, we're going to be talking about this more later. This is called the Mongol variation, by the way. In this position, one line which, and the reason I believe you call this the Indian defense is that a lot of Indian players such as Pragnahanda and Nihal Sarin, they've been playing this line where they put a knight on e7 instead. And one of the ideas is that say if white ever tries to play c3, at least one of the ideas I believe is that we can sometimes afford to play knight g6 and just simply ignore the d4 pawn. I should also note that white cannot just simply take on c6 and win a pawn like this, because in this position what black can do actually is to play queen e7, and white has to be very careful to not get overly greedy in this position, because if they do, for example, bishop f4, this is going to start running some dangerous moves like g5, h5, and all of a sudden if, white is not careful, things are going to get, well, I think already, like really ugly. But of course, this is a very optimistic variation. This won't always happen. A lot of the times people just like keep the tension. They might push d5 or something. They might play bishop g5, provoke f6. This is like a very new variation still, so if you want something that's very fresh and probably not analyzed a whole lot, while maybe it's not the most objectively correct variation in the world, I mean, I think of best play, white probably isn't going to be gaining much more than a slight advantage, which is how it is in a lot of these offbeat variations in general, right? But again, if that doesn't bother you, I think this is a very interesting variation which you could analyze. But on that note of bishop c5 variations in Ruy Lopez, now I want to talk about the so-called Monga and Neo Archangel openings, and with this is also going to come not just those but also the Archangel, which is basically this big clusterfuck of openings which are very similar upon the surface and can very often transpose to each other, but there are some slight differences within each of them. But to start off with, we're going to be looking at both the Monga and Neo Archangel openings. These ones are very similar, so I'm grouping them together. The Archangel is a little bit different, which is a bit ironic because you would expect the Archangel and Neo Archangel to be most similar, but just trust me, this is how it goes. So the Monga, first of all, is where black plays bishop c5 immediately, and the Neo Archangel is where we go b5, bishop b3, then bishop c5. Right off the bat, one of the most sort of prominent differences between these two is that in this position, black can actually play a4. I don't think it's the scariest variation in the world. We can play, say, rook b8 in this position. I don't think we should go bishop b7. I'll discuss why a bit later on. Well, actually, I'll say right now, it's namely that white can play d3 in this position. And I don't really think this combination of playing against d3 setups from white and putting the bishop on b7, which is basically what the Archangel is when black plays bishop b7, right? I don't think it's the smartest idea in the world, which is why we're going to keep this bishop more flexible, not committed yet, play rook b8. But coming back to the Monga, one difference there is that white doesn't really get those a4 variations because, of course, the bishop is blocking the damn way. So what very often will happen is white will play c3, black will play b5, bishop b3, One extra option that white gets in the manga is bishop c2, but black has this very sharp line at their disposal where they can play d5, and I don't really believe this to be like a drawback of, say, playing the manga versus again the Neo Archangel where you go b5, then bishop c5, where of course when we did it this way, white did not get that option of putting the bishop on c2. But looking at probably the main line that's most likely to occur from both of these variations is where white plays c3, we play d6, they go d4, and it's very important to understand that if you take, which is a very common mistake in the database actually, white takes back, and this is just a very bad position that you never want to go into. Really terrible. White has this very dominant center, and yeah, you don't want to play like this. Instead, what you want to do is after d4, you want to retreat with the bishop. And one thing that a lot of people seem to be under the misconception of is that this endgame, like, oh, if you trade all these pieces off and then take, now the black king can't castle. What a pity. But the reality is, again, of course, in the endgame, we don't really need our king to castle that much, and we can conveniently meet a move such as bishop takes f7 with rook f8. If they just move to any random square, we're going to take on this next. And if they say instead go to somewhere like d5, trying to hold on to that guy, we're completely fine with this. We're going to play bishop b7, win back the pawn in the next move, and it's very difficult for them to defend because if they go rook d1, then they hang the f2 pawn. However, the reason this is going into the B tier and not higher is that in general I find these positions just a little bit unpleasant. If white say plays something like bishop e3, knight bd2, sort of keeps attention. At least playing through a bunch of games, again, I've never really played this so much for the black side, definitely haven't ever really faced it from the white side either, so I might not be the most qualified person in the world to say, but my general impression is that if you're going to play this, you're probably going to want to study this quite well, because there's a lot of complexities I feel like you have to deal with this little big pawn center and the bishop being in this diagonal. There's a lot of nuances where you have to watch out for white timing d5 at the right time and creating tension between these bishops. So personally, I'm not sure it's my thing, but for some of you guys who want something a bit more sort of confrontational, this might be for you. However, going back to the Archangel, this is where white plays bishop b7 in this move. If white plays something like rook e1, we're going to play bishop c5, and now very likely to say we get c3, d6, d4, and we get something very similar to what we were just looking at, where bishop b6, right? And black is, you know, pretty happy in general for these sorts of positions. However, the issue is that when we put a bishop on b7, white's most critical step is to go for d3, and now essentially what they're saying is, black, screw you, I don't like your bishop, I'm just going to blunt it by putting my pawn here instead of the more like active d4 square. And for our bishop on b7, that's pretty sad. It doesn't really like this diagonal, and again, that is the whole purpose of the Neo Archangel, where we delay putting our bishop on b7 instead of put our bishop on c5 like this. But now if white goes for d3, well, we have not committed our bishop to the b7 square. We are in general just a lot more happy to go for these variations. So now finally getting into the A tier. B tier stuff, like, that was already pretty legit, but this stuff is like really legit in my opinion. But the first line we're going to be talking about is the Fianchetto defense where black plays g6. And again, this is very similar to the Cosio we were talking about earlier where black plays knight e7, then plays g6 later on, but there was that concrete issue of knight c3, g6, d4 takes knight d5 that I really did not like. Whereas when you go for the quick g6, now you can't really do that because of course we're controlling d4 a lot more quickly. So very often what is considered white's most critical option in these sorts of lines is to go for a quick c3, d4. Black very often replies say bishop g7, or actually probably I think a6 is a slightly more accurate move order, let's say. Now if bishop a4, now bishop g7, white's going to play d4 eventually. And unlike many other variations in the Ruy Lopez where it's a bit of a mistake to take on d4, in the Fianchetto defense, we actually embrace this sort of imbalance, so to speak, of taking, and after e takes d4 playing knight e7, or you could play b5 first, it doesn't matter too much, let's say this though, knight e7, castles, and say if we go knight c3, d6, white plays any random move. Black in this position, statically speaking, does not look like they're doing too well. White has a space advantage, it isn't clear what our plan is going to be, but that all changes with our next move, knight a5, bishop c2, c5, and now we really understand what sacrificing the center was all for. Again, when we played e takes d4, we gave up the center, didn't really make a whole lot of sense, our parents were questioning our decisions, but then we eventually showed our parents what it was all for, right? We played bishop c2, c5, strike back, and look who the winners are, us. And actually, believe it or not, the engines already think that this is pretty good for black. In practice, black also scores really tremendously. Really fascinating position. I would definitely play this from the black perspective, because like the ways that white gets an advantage is by playing sort of weird stuff that no one really knows. Like for example, in this position d5, knight a5, bishop d2. In the Lichess database at least, this is being played in like around 100, 200 games. And there are like thousands of games from like this position, right? But basically, by the way, the point with this variation is that now it's a lot more difficult in this sort of position for black to get in the desired like breaks with d6 and c5 and whatnot. white will also probably play bishop c3, trying to trade off the darks with bishops. And there's also some other maybe problem lines where, like say very early on, white can play d4, and instead of taking back, they can play the much more rare bishop g5, now sort of forcing some concession from black, either to play f6 or bishop e7, trading the darks with bishops. I don't think this is the end of the world. If I did think that, again, I probably wouldn't be placing it in the A tier. And you know, if the fianchetto defense was like one of the main lines against Ruy Lopez, and this stuff was all well known, then it would probably have to be bumped down to like the B, maybe the C tiers. But this is again where, like, this tier list, right, it's not just based upon, like, here's what the computer evaluation says. Okay, I saw this in the S tier, I saw this in the A tier. That's not how I'm doing this, right? It's also based upon practical, somewhat surprise value, but not completely, right? And in general, the types of positions we get in the fianchetto defense, not only do white players not know the theory very often, but middle game positions like these ones, for example, are very difficult and sort of unconventional for many white players to handle, which again is why I'm putting this in the A tier. So for our second entry into the A tier, we're going to be talking about the open Spanish, which is radically different to basically every other line in the Ruy Lopez I can think of, where in this position we take on e4 instead of going for something like bishop e7, which is more of a normie move, right? With knight takes e4, we basically declare to white that war is on, right? Where now white's best move is to play d4, black plays b5, kicking the bishop away, bishop b3, now we play d5 to sort of reinforce the knight on the square, and after d takes e5, this pawn is under attack, so we play bishop e6, and this is the starting position of the open Ruy Lopez or open Spanish. But of course, compared to most of the other normal positions where the center is more closed, the center is much more open this one. We've created a lot of weaknesses in our camp. For example, the c5 square comes to mind because we're sort of advancing all of these pawns. These queenside pawns could also technically be overextended according to some. And if I'm being perfectly honest, the open Spanish is not really my cup of tea. I don't really like these positions, but if you're say more of a tactical player who doesn't really mind learning some theory, because you will have to if you play the open Spanish, where players are a lot more sort of confrontational and less sort of strategic and whatnot, this might be the line for you. Again, personally, it's not really for me, but I think this is a line which a lot of players seem to forget about. But personally, I think that's unjustified. This is being played at the top level by many strong players over the decades, and still it's not like there's a refutation of this or anything. So again, I really do recommend the open Spanish to players who do have that more sort of aggressive streak to their play. For the final line in the A tier, however, we're going to be talking about the closed Spanish, and I'm not going to be talking about in particular anything like the Breyer or the Zaitsev, for example. I just am going to be grouping those all together. We're in this position again after castles, h3. I should also note that if white plays an immediate d4, bishop g4, and it's difficult for white to keep the tension in this position because of the amount of pressure we have this pin, the pressure on the d4 pawn. Technically, this is like quite playable for white, but definitely by far the main line is for h3 to be played in this position. And this is where the main three options are knight a5, the Chigorin, the Breyer with knight b8, and then on top of that, the Zaitsev, where you think here the bishop to b7. And all of these have their own sort of unique bodies of theory, very rich positions. But one thing that's also worth taking into account is that for many decades, this has been sort of referred to as a so-called Spanish torture. And it's called that because what you sort of get in many of these positions are ones where white owns the center, black is very much trying to counterattack against that. And it very often feels like black is just sort of walking this tightrope between sort of being okay, but at the same time, at least in the practical sense, being under a lot of pressure. It always feels like white just had a bit more of a pleasant position, and is in large part a reason why, if you look at the choices of many top opening players these days, they are not going for these close Spanish positions. And that's not to say it's bad per se, and not that necessarily we should be trying to replicate their opening choices perfectly as well, but just from a purely objective standpoint, that these variations, while they do have a long and rich history and definitely worth learning, I think for just your overall sort of chess education, so to speak, it's difficult to quite like rate them like as S tier material, right, up with the other variations we're going to be talking about very soon. And so now we're finally going to be talking about the holy grail of the S tier. Whether you skipped right to this or you've watched like the last however many minutes that have led us up to this point, I want to congratulate you on making it to this far in the video, where the first one we're going to be talking about is none other than the dreaded burrowing defense. And some of you, right, are going to be like, Sam, did you really put the burrowing in S tier? The burrowing is so boring, I'm unsubscribing from the channel. That's all completely fine with me, but say what you want about the burrowing, it is undeniably an incredibly solid defense against the Ruy Lopez. It is the reason why a lot of strong players, they don't even play the Ruy Lopez. They would rather play the Italian, just because they hate the burrowing so much. However, there are multiple sort of components to this sort of burrowing defense, right? Like, you can castle and you can go for d4 and go down the road of the burrowing endgame. A lot of strong players have sort of given up on this these days. Personally, as black, I would actually quite enjoy playing this position because in general, I like endgames. It's sort of my style as a player to play these sorts of positions. I have the two bishops, there's sort of imbalances in the position. But there, of course, are some other lines that white can go for, like playing rook e1. And this is considered to be like a very boring line by a lot of players where you essentially get this pretty like symmetrical structure, very little imbalance, kind of boring, where arguably white's just the one pushing for like that small kind of slight edge, right? And I had one friend I was talking to like last week, I think, where he was basically saying to me, and I somewhat agree, that like he would play the burrowing if it was just like this endgame, right? But he doesn't really like the fact that there's this sort of very symmetrical position where against like a lower rated player, for example, it's very difficult to actually play for a win. But I think definitely is something like against higher rated players, let's say, this is a position which definitely I would be happy on entering. Very little risk, it feels like, difficult for them to sort of win. I wouldn't mind a draw necessarily. But definitely I agree with what my other friend was saying, that like if this was a must win game, would you want to play the burrowing? Like the endgame I wouldn't mind actually, like there's decent winning potential. But this one, this is a lot more difficult to win in my opinion. And then there's also like the d3 lines. These are possible at various points in the Spanish, to be honest. So I wouldn't really say this is something unique to the burrow or anything like that. But nonetheless, it's something you have to keep in mind. When you play the burrowing, there's going to be a lot of times where you're not just getting the end game. You're going to be getting a lot of, say, like these positions or these ones. And you have to be ready to face that. But for the final boss in this video, we're going to be talking about the martial defense. For a long time, I have to admit, I heard about the martial when I was younger, but I actually had no idea what it was. Maybe you guys are in the same boat, maybe you're not. But nonetheless, what the martial is where black plays knight f6. We play all the same moves, kind of leading up to what we saw earlier. Except in this position, by the way, it's quite important to understand, I didn't mention this earlier, but the timing of the move, castles, is very important because if you just castle in this position, well now white's in a prime situation to actually take on c6, and after d takes c6, go knight takes e5, and they just simply win a queen pawn, because a very typical sort of retort to this move, queen d4, like say in this early position where if they try to do the same thing, obviously this time it doesn't work, whereas further down the line, if we go these few moves, sorry, we're in the wrong line, say this one, right, where now castle takes, because the rook is protecting this, right, of course we're just losing the pawn, there's no way this works. So you always have to be aware of these sorts of minute details in the move order, very important, otherwise you're not even going to get to the position that you wanted to in the first place, you're going to get to a lost position where you're down a pawn for no reason. So that's why we play b5 in this position, and the close Spanish is where we go d6. The martial is where we go castles, however, and there's a very important nuance here to pick up, which is that now if white plays d3, because we have not spent a tempo with our d pawn, we can actually go d5. And now if white takes this, it looks like they can just win a free pawn. But actually, this is a really cool concept of the martial where we can now play c6, protect the knight. We can go bishop d6 now, kick the rook away. For example, d4, bishop d6, rook e1, we play queen h4. We swing all our pieces over to the king side and basically just bank on the idea that it's going to be really, really difficult for white to ward off all of our difficult threats. And despite these sort of tricky gambits against Ruy Lopez or very reputable openings in that sort of category, right, generally being quite dubious, the martial is sort of an interesting exception where not only can you get this very sort of aggressive dynamic chess going on, but it's also sound according to the computer. But there is also sort of arguably a drawback behind that in that because this line is very direct confrontational, there's also a lot of theory that goes with that, and you can sort of, if you're at a lower level, sort of wing it a lot more. Your opponent's not going to know the theory, so you don't really have to know it that well either in some sense. However, I should note that there is more to the martial than just this, right? Like, a lot of people these days, much like how in the Berlin, right, we have to skip back a couple moves, but much like how many players are sick of trying to go into the main line with castles, knight takes e4, d4, and play all these moves and go into the Berlin endgame, which is why, like, very often we see d3 these days trying to keep more tension in the position. It's very much the same thing with the martial, where a lot of players will not play c3. Strong players rarely play this these days, because a lot of these lines have just been analyzed to a draw at the top level, so there's not really much point in going into this. Instead, they'd much rather play in lines such as after castles, say like a4, or like h3, where now if you go d5, it doesn't really pack the same punch, because it's important to understand the martial only really works because when you play c3, you create somewhat of a weakness on the light squares. Like if white just played a very civilian move such as d3 in this position, aiming for, again, more of a d3 Spanish sort of thing, you can't really go d5 because like they're just going to take it, they're going to take, And what they're going to do is they're just going to play knight d2, knight f3, protect the kind of king side. You might kick them away with one move, but they just retreat. But again, these deviations do not take away from the marshal. What you have to do when you play these sorts of lines is switch to more of a positional mode, which maybe you don't want to, but you sort of have to. Like, okay, there are some sort of weird sidelines, like in this position. I think d5 is still technically a thing. It's not really sound. And against like a3, for example, you can go bishop b7, d3, then d5. There still are these very active options, but it's not quite like the same as a full-fledged martial attack in this line, right? But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say for today's video. If you liked it, please like, subscribe also, and if you think I missed anything, leave a comment down below, right? But yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say for today. Hope you guys have a good one, and yeah, I'll see you until next time.